During the rise of the Renaissance, many artists expressed desires to expand the thought behind their trade. Artists before the time used paintings and sculptures only to depict biblical and spiritual properties. Artists during the Renaissance wished to ask questions about why these depictions took place in the time they did. The movement behind expanding art not just to display of a subject, but representation of a story, was the origins of humanism. This movement not only affected art, it also affected music, literature, and academia, which covered the spiritual society. The Renaissance and humanism sought to push those expressions of self into the secular world. As the concept of making art accessible to the secular public became popular, many artists used techniques in their paintings to add emphasis on their subject matter. This is what made the Renaissance different from medieval art. Previously, artists never used realistic proportions that humanistic artists did. As an example, in Masaccio's The Holy Trinity, the painting depicts Jesus crucified to a cross with the perspective of the painting being at the base of the cross looking up. The vanishing point of the painting is the base of the cross to signify Jesus' divine importance. Masaccio wasn't the only notable artist of the time. Some of the most infamous artists like Donatello, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo Buonarroti, Raphael, and Diego Velázquez all contributed to the advancements of painting during this time. The Renaissance had a profound effect not just on painting or sculpture, but music and literature as well. Without humanist artists, the medium would never be easily available to the general public. The late 18th and early 19th centuries were the starts of the Romantic period of art. Artists inspired by the Greek and Roman sculptures of the past wanted to make art that emphasized the most forefront figures. This movement to make art idealized and aesthetically pleasing to look at was neoclassicism. The movement not only affected art and sculpture, but it affected architecture and fashion as well. One such artist who spearheaded neoclassicism as the first somewhat modern art movement was Jacques-Louis David in his painting The Oath of Horace. David emphasized the figures in the foreground who appeared to be having a duel with swords. After the initial success of the neoclassic movement, many artists wanted to tap into the emotional side of art. This is when art became more subjectively beautiful and is why this era is so synonymous with Romanticism. Just as Chopin, Paganini, Stravinsky, and Debussy were all great composers of the Romantic period, Francisco Goya, Eugene Delacroix were great artists of the period. Their art focused on emotional subject matter, like in the 3rd of May depicting a protest in the middle of the 19th century. New technology arose to allow innovations in the way people compose art. With the invention of the camera, many landscape painters saw a new form of art as a threat to their life. However, this new medium of photography would launch art to the mainstream. Nadar and Timothy O'Sullivan were the first most prominent photographers of their day. They captured pictures of people and landscapes in qualities that painting just couldn't. To try and compete with photography, painters made subject matter of their paintings uncannily real. Thus, realism was born. This movement focused on depicting idealism without exaggerating the matter in the paintings. Artists used many methods from math and science to measure dimensions of the figures they were painting. Regardless of incentives behind photographers or realists, both forms of media drove art from the dawn of humanism onward to the 20th century. If the Renaissance was the celebration of art entering secular life, and Romantic era art was a leap in technical innovation, then the 20th century was the fully realized potential that the great artists of the past wanted to have. The 20th century saw the rise of two of the most popular movements in history. One was Fauvism and the other was Expressionism. Fauvism comes from the nickname Le Fauve, which translates to the wild beasts. A group of French painters wanting to follow in the footsteps of Vincent van Gogh became attracted to the idea of broad brushstrokes, bright colors, and a mixture of abstract and subjective material. Artists in Fauvism were avant-garde. The artists of the movement wished to push the boundaries of art even further than what came before. An example of this is in Henri Matisse's Le Bonheur de Vivre, The Joy of Life. This painting depicts a mix of vibrant colors with pink figures as a metaphor for the experience of sexual intercourse. This piece falls under an expressive style that led to the second prominent art movement of the 20th century, Expressionism. Michelangelo famously said that if a painting is unimpactful, then the audience won't remember what you said, what you did, or how you made them feel. Expressionism took this claim to heart and focused as much as their energy on the emotional impact of their pieces. Whereas Fauvism had its start in French, Expressionism began in Germany. On top of Germany being the home of famous musical composers such as Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, and many more, artists such as Kirchner and Kandinsky began to look up to art not just as a medium of self-expression, but as a gateway into one's innermost self. This is evident in Wassily Kandinsky's composition 4, where Kandinsky said he wanted to capture the feeling of the spectator and what they feel rather than what he felt while making his painting. He became infatuated with the finished product and not the journey of the product. This resulted in his paintings bursting with color. Although the piece is abstract, the meaning behind the piece is the apex of historical art. It's important to emphasize that most mainstream art movements came out of Europe. However, these different expressions of art weren't the only movements in the world. In America, many people, traumatized by the horrors they saw during the First World War, turned to a new form of art expression which sought to go against the traditional evolution of European art. This abstract movement in the United States was Dada. Dada rejected the idealized art from Europe as they thought of it as not challenging enough. Dada was a protest of the American government for sending innocent boys off to go die in a war that they thought they had no business being in the first place. The name of Dada became a rallying cry for this movement. The name came about by someone sticking a knife into a dictionary and forming the words. Many artists protested the preconceived notion of art, such as in the LHOOQ by Marcel Duchamp, who took the painting of the Mona Lisa and drew a mustache on it as in defiance of those who represented and respected Leonardo da Vinci. On the other side of the Atlantic Ocean, Europeans continued to evolve their art from Expressionism, which focused on the surface-level emotions of people. Artists from the mid-1920s wanted to tap into the subconscious and express subjects such as dreams and nightmares. This movement became Surrealism. Surrealism was the thought that science and rationality were throwing European culture out of tradition. Artists thought that society was moving too fast, and they used art as a means to express their frustration with society and government. One such painting that emphasized this was in René Magritte's The Lovers. Two figures, assumed to be a man and a woman, are both wearing white sheets over their head. Maybe this piece was a commentary on the concept of loveless relationships and how people aren't interested in the personal aspects of someone's self. Instead, people only care about the physical/sexual sides of a relationship. Many artists didn't use realism to convey what they felt, but both movements of Dada and Surrealism stretched the definition of art to its most abstract form. After World War II, America entered into a new wave of art practice that the world had never seen before. The Second World War made Americans reevaluate the way they saw art and life, and thus the rock and roll era of art began. The first form of mid-20th century art was a movement called abstract expressionism. Like Expressionism of the Romantic period, artists wanted to capture emotion and connect paintings to viewers on an emotional level. However, the way artists who went about this were completely different from past artists. One artist was a man named Jackson Pollock, who composed his paintings by laying the canvas on the ground and dripping paint onto the canvas in a flat setting. Then, the paintings would be displayed from a wall instead of the floor. This allowed the audience and the artists to look at the medium from a different point of view. The post-World War II outlook not only affected art, but also had an impact on buildings in huge cities that began to represent less of the European style and present more of blocky slabs of concrete and steel, signifying the technological advancements of construction, artists, and society. Other forms of art started coming to the forefront. Assemblages were works of art that people would make from everyday household items, which made people look at everyday and normal items from a different perspective. Art started becoming performative. Public events held in town squares showcased artists' work as these once-in-a-lifetime extravaganzas that caught the eye of mainstream media. As art became more public, it was only natural that it also became more popular. Pop art began in the 1960s and was as opposed to someone making it in their home or studio. Art like this was usually the result of factory or corporations that made labels, stickers, and other commercialized goods. Minimal and conceptual art took to their most basic tenets once again. Earthworks were pieces that were too big to be in a museum. These art movements are when the mainstream art hub started to move away from Europe and become more Americanized. Finally, after centuries of evolution, art reaches the present. From the 1970s through the current present, humans have evolved the way people make art. A new and most recent art movement that recently come to light is a movement called Neo-Expressionism. This movement started in the late 70s through the early 80s and revived the personal style of making art. People can see this in the style of 21st century building structures, cars, and even the media. With new media came art forms such as content creation, live streaming, home music making, and cinematography. All of these genres help to distinguish Neo-Expressionism and postmodernism from the regularly contested modernism. As with anything, change can come at any moment. Art is no different. The reason why postmodernism is different from modernism is that art falls under its inherently newer works of modernism. Art, music, and other realms of creativity have all evolved over the span of centuries. Before, if someone wanted to go see a play or a concert, you needed to be part of a high society. In recent years, these mediums exist in middle-class society and have for decades. Some see this as a negative thing. They see normal people having access to art as a detriment to art itself because it undermines its value. However, others say that art is subjective. Anyone can do it. Anyone can pick up a paintbrush and paint onto a canvas. Anyone can pick up a guitar or sit down at a piano and play. That's the point. By making art accessible to the mass public, art has now the widest audience it ever has had in the past. So many institutions such as museums, galleries, and universities allow these alternative spaces where audiences from all walks of life come to study art, its history, and the impact on the world. This wasn't possible hundreds of years ago. Thanks to the rise of the internet, people can now create art from their bedrooms and broadcast it to millions of people all over the world. From the Renaissance to the present day, the impact of art on the general population may change, but it will never go away.